I hope that most of you have attended that lecture and you're familiar, and I won't do a long introduction. Just to let you know that I think Detlef has done more than anyone else a significant body of work on the whole question of transparency, revising the work that was done by Colin Rowe, among others. I also think that the work that Detlef has done is among the most significant and interesting in terms of crossing the barrier between architectural production and architectural theory, the kind of work that gets done in schools related to the whole area of sort of architectural criticism. And I'm very pleased that he has been part of the AA both last term and this term again for the last 10 days or so. Tonight's talk, entitled Seeing the Closed Open, Walter Benjamin and the Tectonic Unconscious, focuses on Benjamin's treatment of Karl Böttischer's tectonic theory, as well as Alfred Meyer and Siegfried Gideon's interpretation of the new spatiality and optics of iron structures. Detlef has edited a wonderful collection of essays under the title The Presence of Mies, published by Princeton Architectural Press, and recently made a contribution to the publication that accompanied the exhibition at the Carnegie Museum called Monolithic Architecture, as well as another publication called Alphabet City 4, Fascism and Its Ghost. He has a variety of essays appearing very soon in assemblage, in any an essay in a book called Architecture and Cubism, which is to be published by MIT Press, a contribution to a book called Hader Chronotopes, to be published by Princeton Architectural Press, and another contribution to a book called The Origins of the Avant-Garde in America. Would you please join me in welcoming Detlef Mertins?
Thank you, Mohsen. It's wonderful to be back. I'm going to go straight into the paper. Like the paper I gave here in the fall, this one concerns Walter Benjamin's transformative readings of modernist architectural histories and theories, which he undertook most intently from about 1929 to 33 for his Arcades project and his image of glass architecture, which recurs in various writings. Both papers are, however, part of a larger research on the ideal of transparency as it was thought by modernist architects, critics, and historians, especially those working in the tradition of rationalist aesthetics. In the context of this larger project, which is structured in relation to the role that transparency plays in the writings of Siegfried Gideon, I turned to Benjamin in order to mark a shift from the ideal of transparency understood in cognitive as well as visual terms, and implicitly, if not explicitly, as utopian and incomplete, to what Terence Riley in his recent show Light Construction at the Museum of Modern Art has identified as the interest in current reworkings of modern architecture in translucencies, reflections, veiled, blocked, and delayed vision. Could I have the first slide, or do I do that here? Sorry, how do I... do I control them here? I'm sorry, the two forward, okay, got them. Okay, from Riley's exhibition examples of current projects that deal with translucencies, reflections, and delayed or blocked vision. Himself reworking the distinction between literal and phenomenal transparency, which Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky made in their celebrated essay of 1963, Riley suggested that our time was no longer one of glass walls producing rooms of shadowless light, but was marked instead by a preoccupation with the hidden, the obscured, the ambiguous surface, the impossibility of pure vision or knowledge. While Rowe and Slutsky had, as is well known, relegated the transparency of Walter Gropius's Bauhaus at Dessau of 1926 and the so-called transparent paintings of László Moholy-Nagy to the lowly status of a property of substance, to the literal transparency of glass and pigment, in other words, to something too simple and direct to provide pleasure, they had at the same time commended the striated spatiality of Fernand Léger's paintings and Le Corbusier's purist architecture. These were for them demonstrative of a phenomenal transparency that operated by means of perceptual ambiguity, generating spatial affects through the optical oscillation of overlapping planes on a two-dimensional surface. We've gone ahead here. Wrong way around. Sorry, I'm going to have to... I've been punching the wrong side. There we go. Riley's conception of light construction appears to have taken this phenomenal transparency as its precursor. There's the Léger, the Le Corbusier. And thereby transformed what had been for Rowe and Slutsky a distinction of species within the avant-garde into a distinction between modern transparency and the hazy, blocked visuality of postmodernity. And of course, in many ways, this certainly has been the case. However, as Rowe and Slutsky themselves suggested, Gideon and Moholy's ideal of material transparency was mobilized for the aim of another, for them, higher and ethereal transparency, whose signs were, among other things, montage optics, dematerialization, open constructions without determined contours, and the indeterminacy of identity, themes that seem to still have some resonance today. For Gideon, the striving for transparency operated, in fact, at two levels. Firstly, as a material transparency, or more precisely, a transparency of rationally self-determined architectonic means, such as concrete slabs, curtain walls, etc., reduced and purified to their most essential technical forms. And secondly, as the affect of space-time transparency that the deployment of these elemental means could achieve for the observer, and with it a hitherto unknown freedom of the imagination. In retrospect, what appears to have been at stake in Rowe and Slutsky's critique was in fact their competing claim, first to the architecture of Le Corbusier, and second to the phenomenology of space, for them classical rather than anti-classical, two-dimensional rather than four-dimensional, static rather than dynamic, ahistorical and timeless rather than active in time, sustaining intellectual pleasure rather than the ecstatic pleasure of construction spirituelle, which is how Gideon in 1941 described the purest architecture of Le Corbusier. Notwithstanding Riley's apparent leanings toward the Rowe and Slutsky position, however, many of the projects in his show appear to have greater affinity with the space-time transparency of Gideon and Moholy. If, as Tony Vidler has suggested, Rem Koolhaas's project for the Bibliothèque Nationale signaled the emergence of this interest in block transparency, doesn't its visual and spatial sensibility, not to mention its mysterious luminosity and internal dynamic, have a greater affinity with Moholy's photograms and photographs than with Léger's striated paintings? In fact, I would suggest that that in an image such as this, Koolhaas has taken what Moholy had thought marked transparency and turned it by the most subtle of means, by merely a shift of degree, like adjusting the brightness control on a computer screen, into its opposite, into opacity. Now, the point of my lecture tonight is to show that Walter Benjamin had already done something rather like that, albeit in notes for an unwritten text rather than in models for an unbuilt design. And he did it in a way that combined the aesthetic and the social, which is something that Riley held out as a potential or programmatic goal at the conclusion of his essay, pointing to Todd Williams and Billy Tsien's mobile translucent stage set as evoking societal transformations, and to Dan Graham's two-way mirror cylinder inside Cube as a utopian presence on the roofscape of New York. Benjamin's reworking of the romantic and idealist traditions that underpinned Gideon's portrait of modern architecture enabled him to draw this potentiality out, I would say more radically than these projects, while correcting for Gideon's premature claims that a new harmony and unity had already been achieved. Since this talk will look not only at Benjamin's reading of Gideon, but also his comments on Karl Böttcher, a key theorist of tectonics in the middle of the 19th century, and his appropriations from Alfred Gotthold Meyer, who wrote one of the earliest histories of engineered constructions in iron, let me make a brief comment about tectonics and how the issue of transparency has been structured there. In recent architectural discourse, the term tectonics has come to be invoked as a non-representational, even anti-representational ground for architecture understood as a transparent, self-knowing self-construction that could be enlisted in the service of resistance or poetics of authenticity. A few years ago, however, the American historian of architectural theory, Mitchell Schwarzer, showed how in the 19th century, particularly in the writings of Böttger at mid-century, tectonics had been a theory of representation. With this, Schwarzer reopened a topic that had seemed closed. Even more importantly, he went on to isolate one of the thorniest issues of representation operative within it, the relationship of self-representation to alterity. Schwarzer's presentation of Böttger's tectonics centered on the hermeneutic problem of architectural ornamentation or representation, seeking to interpret the raw ontological moment in which artifice is created out of unformed matter, and thereby draw the unformed into the world of formal conventions. Last year, in a panel discussion with Schwarzer in Toronto, the literary critic Julian Patrick pointed out that this tectonic problematic of authentic representation was in fact structured by a rhetorical trope, the chiasmus, struggling constantly to bridge the unbridgeable gap between self and other, known and unknown, conscious and unconscious, in order to stabilize representations prone to coming apart. Patrick's observations confirmed that current theories of tectonics could benefit from contemporary cross-disciplinary investigations into the problematics of representation, and that as these investigations moved into architecture, they in turn could benefit by reviewing the history of tectonic theory. In what follows, I focus on three moments in Benjamin's writings, each of which touches on the issue of transparency in relation to representation in a different way. First, Benjamin's reading of Böttger's tectonics as a theory of history, in which the unconscious is posited as a generative and productive source, and in which rational technical forms are presumed to be transparent expressions of themselves. Second, Benjamin's transformation of Gideon's portrait of iron structures as scaffolding for a new kind of spatial experience and a new optics. For Benjamin, they become optical instruments for glimpsing a space interwoven with unconsciousness. And third, Benjamin's suggestion that the mimetic faculty continues to play within representation, history, and technology to produce similarities between the human and the non-human. In each instance, Benjamin reworked the tectonic problematic of representation seeking reconciliation with alterity into a dialectic. In so doing, he transformed the modernist quest for transparency of self-construction, pure presence, and pure vision, setting the cause of revolution, of a modernity yet to come, against metaphysical and utopian claims, progressive and as well as regressive. There are three parts to the paper. The first is called Technical Forms. In the opening segment of his well-known exposé for the Arcades project, Paris, Capital of the 19th Century, written in 1935, Benjamin referred to Böttger, and he was not flattering. For he associated the architectural historian with what he elsewhere referred to as the 19th century's deficient reception of industrial technology, that is, the problematic production of images in which the old persists and intermingles with the new. He called these wish images, in which, quote, the collective seeks to both preserve and to transfigure the incoherentness of the social product and the deficiencies in the social system of production. Benjamin explained that Janus-like, such wish-fulfilling images, which is how Freud had characterized dreams, tended to direct the visual imagination back to the primeval past, thus linking their power of prophecy, for that which is to follow first appears in the images of dreams, to elements from prehistory, that is, of a classless society. Intimations of a classless society, archived in the collective unconscious, mingle with the new to, quote, produce the utopia that has left its traces in thousands of configurations of life, from permanent buildings to fleeting fashions. Benjamin offered Charles Fourier's utopian vision of a community housed in a phalansterie as such an image that combines promise and problematics, the arcades and the Palace of Versailles. He considered its architecture a reactionary transformation of the arcades into, quote, the colorful idyll of Biedermeier, inserted into the austere formal world of the empire. For Benjamin, it was the destiny of the working masses to realize the non-instrumental potentiality of industry, and yet the latent physiognomy of technical forms remained constrained under the rule of the bourgeoisie, just as the workers were themselves. Concurring with Max Weber's analysis of how Enlightenment rationality had disenchanted the world, he nevertheless recognized that modernity was not yet free of myth. Things produced as commodities under the conditions of alienated labor were enveloped by false mythologies, as evident in advertisements, fashion, and architecture. Capitalism, he noted in the Passagenwerk, is a natural phenomenon with which a new dream sleep came over Europe, and in it a reactivation of mythic powers. These myths, which Georg Lukács had drawn attention to as characteristic of the class consciousness of the bourgeoisie, gave the world of reified commodities the appearance and status of nature, a second nature that occluded the original as it exploited it. To awaken from the nightmare of capitalist phantasmagoria, to dissolve mythology into the space of history, was Benjamin's principal aim for the Arcades project, which he thought of in terms similar to the work of dreams and dream analysis as his Passagenarbeit, or work of passage. In Geoffrey Mailman's apt formulation, Benjamin's work on the phantasmagoric glass and iron arcades of Paris constituted a devastating enactment of the messianic dream of plunging into evil, albeit to defeat it from within. Benjamin's reading of Böttcher was informed by these problematics of dream consciousness, the resistance posed by the old for passage across the threshold of modernity into an undistorted and fully revolutionary state of redemption. Having noted in the expose that the emergence of construction in iron was critical for the appearance of the skylit and gaslit Parisian arcades during the fashion boom around 1820, Benjamin referred to Böttcher's conviction that the art forms of the new system of iron construction must follow the formal principle of the Hellenic mode. He then indicted the empire style, which conformed to this prescription, as the equivalent in architecture to revolutionary terrorism in politics, for which he said the state was an end in itself. Invoking a kind of functionalism against the politics of historicism, which served to legitimate the present by reiterating the forms of the past, he wrote, "Just as Napoleon little realized the functional nature of the state as an instrument of the rule of the bourgeois class, so the master builders of his time equally little realized the functional nature of iron, with which the constructional principle entered upon its rule in architecture. These master builders fashioned supports in the style of the Pompeian column, factories in the style of the dwelling houses, just as later the first railway stations were modeled on chalets." That Benjamin sided with the engineer against the architect is clear from the first segment of the expose, in which he suggested that engineering had a revolutionary role to play, not only for architecture but for society. Having already introduced this theme in his essay on surrealism of 1929, and again more radically in Experience and Poverty of 1933, Benjamin returned to it at the end of the expose. There he took up what he called the surrealist's gaze across the ruination of the bourgeoisie, and observed as follows. The development of the forces of production had turned the wish symbols of the previous century into rubble, even before the monuments which represented them had crumbled. This development during the 19th century liberated the forms of creation from art, just as in the 16th century the sciences freed themselves from philosophy. A start is made by architecture as engineering. By linking artistic architecture to the phantasmagoria of bourgeois capitalism, while at the same time linking engineering architecture to social revolution, Benjamin radicalized and politicized the conflict between engineering and architecture that had marked the 19th century. He drew it into the overarching dialectical struggle between classes and between new and old. In this context, Benjamin's reading of Böttcher's tribute of 1846 to Carl Friedrich Schinkel takes on a rather strategic significance for the dialectical theory of architecture that may be glimpsed between the lines of his writings. It was, of course, in this text, titled The Principles of the Hellenic and Germanic Ways of Building with regard to their application to our present way of building, that Böttger had extended his theory of tectonics to the matter of iron. Having previously analyzed the two great historical styles, the trabeated Hellenic system and the vaulted Germanic Gothic, he turned to speculate on the architecture of the future, the new architecture that so many of in the 19th century longed for so intensely. In the notes of the Passagenwerk, Benjamin assembled the following excerpts from Böttger. This is a bit lengthy, but I think it's worth getting the whole thing. Another art will emerge from the womb of time and will take on a life of its own, an art in which a different structural principle will sound a more ringing keynote than the other two. A new and so far unknown system of covering, which will of course bring in its train a new world of art forms, can appear only with the adoption of an unknown material, or rather a material that so far has not been used as a guiding principle. Such a material is iron, whose rule for these purposes began in our century. Further testing and greater knowledge of its structural properties will ensure that iron will become the basis for the covering system of the future, and that structurally it will, in times to come, be superior to the Hellenic and medieval systems, as the arcuated medieval system was to the monolithic trabeated system of antiquity. The structural principle is thus to be adopted from the arcuated system and transformed into a new and hitherto unknown system. For the art forms of the new system, on the other hand, the formative principle of the Hellenic style must be adopted. For Böttger, then, the new iron architecture had a double origin: structure pursuing a new and hitherto unknown system, while art assimilated the new to the old principles of antique form. In his earlier writings, Böttger had introduced the twin notions of Kernform and Kunstform, technical form and art form, precisely to account for what he took to be the necessary relationship between material origins and idealized representations of material properties and structuring forces in Hellenic and Gothic architecture. This relationship was central to his understanding of architectural style per se as an integrated system of production and symbolization. He conceived of unmediated material and structural self-expression on the one hand, and interpretive self-representation through ornament on the other, as mutually mediating and hence indivisible. In transposing this historical schema into the future, into his speculations about the physiognomy of a new iron architecture, he clearly hoped to promote the emergence of an equally integrative architectonic system for the new epoch. Yet in positing the split between nature and culture as a condition of modernity, Böttger inscribed into his tectonic theory an unending struggle to maintain their mutuality over the process of historical development. If in linking technical form and art form to the opposition between Germanic and Hellenic styles, Böttger had hoped to draw the integrative strength of his dualism to forge a new and higher architecture through stylistic synthesis, his strategy may have had the opposite effect. It merely confirmed the split that was becoming increasingly apparent and freed the impulse for a new structural principle from the obligation of representing itself through the mediation of old tectonic systems. Benjamin's brief commentary on these passages reveals that he took Böttger's notion of a double origin as a sign of conflict rather than the complementary relationship that Böttger had intended. Subtly reworking Böttger's dualism, Benjamin noted that his history demonstrated the, quote, dialectical derivation of iron construction. In so doing, Benjamin was informed by Alfred Gotthold Meyer's prior reworking of tectonic theory in his posthumously published book, Iron Construction of 1907. Benjamin held this book by Meyer in the highest esteem, calling it a prototype of materialist historiography. He singled it out in 1929 as one of 4 books, only 4, that had remained alive, the others being Alois Riegel's Late Roman Art Industry of 1901, Franz Rosenzweig's The Star of Redemption of 1921, and Georg Lukács's History of Class Consciousness of 1923. In his book, Meyer had been critical of the Berlin Tectonic school inaugurated by Schinkel for its insistence that traditional forms and principles of architectonic expression developed for stone and wood be used to assimilate iron construction into the art of architecture. Instead, Meyer adopted engineering as the vital and dynamic basis of a new architecture that would grant to technical forms the potential of a new self-generated beauty. Where Böttger found in 1846 that the various efforts to shake off the shackles of the past had not yet achieved persuasively original art forms or structural systems, Meyer spoke of the Eiffel Tower of 1889 in terms of a new beauty, the beauty of steely sharpness, and the expression of a new tempo of tectonic vitality. While Böttger argued that, quote, the acceptance and continuation of tradition, not its negation, is historically the only correct course for art, leading it toward the destined emergence from tradition to a newborn, original, and unique style, Meyer's later more sachlich and anti-representational approach to the relation between art and iron technology was distinguished by his refusal of any willful symbolization. Instead, he favored the supposed immediacy of material properties, calculations, purposes, and modes of production. He conceived of beauty as the immanent expression not only of the material, but of the society that produced it. Where Böttger feared what remained outside the system of representation, Meyer embraced the rush and terror of the technological sublime. The image on the left is of the bridge over the Firth of Forth, and it appeared as the frontispiece for the book. While rejecting Böttger's prescription for contemporary architecture, Meyer and Benjamin both reiterated aspects of the theory of history that underpins his tectonics, in which material and structural innovations are seen to emerge from a mysterious source. The womb of time was Böttger's expression, to play a leading role in the formation of a new system. For Böttger, a new structural system specific to a new material was to be born out of the old in the same way that a distinctive and integral Roman vaulted architecture had emerged out of the Hellenic through a process of hybridization, mutation, and rationalization. Meyer, too, was interested in the unknowable source of new architectures, but instead of Böttger's metaphors of birth and metamorphosis, Meyer suggested that a new style is always precipitated by, quote, an unconscious urge, and that any generation destined to create a new style will need to start the process of formal creation from the beginning. In the case of iron construction, the drawing board of rational engineering calculations and structural diagrams constituted such a new beginning, with the path of formal self-realization moving from elementary to complex and from part to whole. In Experience in Poverty, Benjamin likewise mobilized the blank rationality of the engineer's drawing board as a groundless ground for a new proletarian society, for beginning again at the beginning, albeit within the phantasmagoria. And in the expose of 1935, he referred to construction as, quote, the subconscious of the 19th century, taking the phrase not from Meyer, but from the young architectural historian Siegfried Giedion, whose book of 1928, Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferro Concrete, Benjamin admired almost as much as Meyer's. Conflating metaphors of organic growth and subconscious impulses, Giedion held that the new forms of iron construction and the new forms of life, mass society, that emerged from them, began as kernels struggling within the old to gradually assume their own identity. His story of the historical passage of iron construction follows a morphological evolution from the simple iron roof frame of the Théâtre Français of 1786 in stages to the full realization of iron's potential in the vast spans and gracefully engineered arcs of the Palais des Machines of 1889. This natural progression was, in his portrayal, hindered by the persistence of tradition among architects until the 20th century, when they finally took up the task of bringing what had emerged in the dark subconscious of industrial labor into the clarity of a self-conscious architectural system, distinguished by a new kind of spatial experience. Benjamin's quotation of Giedion's thesis about construction as the subconscious of the epoch may be considered in relation to this pair of images that Gideon used graphically to present what he took to be the line of development from the glass facade of an exhibition hall of 1848 to the curtain wall of Walter Gropius's Bauhaus at Dessau of 1925 and 6. The technical form, finely purified, refined, and self-reflexive. But it should also be read in conjunction with Benjamin's commentary on it. He wrote, "Shouldn't one rather substitute for the subconscious the role of the bodily processes on which artistic architecture could then lie like dreams supported by the scaffolding of physiological processes?" In reworking Gideon's dualism into a dialectic between physiological processes and phantasmagoric dreams, Benjamin pointed to the immanence of truth within the expression of bodily labors and the physiognomy of historical events. This immanence, however, remained impeded by bourgeois controls, albeit less in the technical realm, unworthy of bourgeois attention, than in the artistic. The architecture of emerging mass society could then be seen as beginning not only in the corrupt form of the bourgeois arcades, but also in the less deficient form of utilitarian structures, engineered bridges, train stations, grain silos, exhibition halls, and of course the factory, the nascent home of workers and engineers. It is, Benjamin wrote, invoking Böttiger's terms, the peculiar property of technical forms as opposed to artistic forms, that their progress and their success are proportionate to the transparency of their social content, hence glass architecture. Even in the technical realm, Benjamin treated this transparency as mediated, historically, materially, and perceptually. With respect to the artistic realm, he suggested, quote, "One can formulate the problem of form for the new art in this way. When and how will the form worlds of the mechanical, in film, in the building of machines, in the new physics, etc., rise up without our help and overwhelm us, make us aware of that which is natural about it?" In other words, when and how would construction, pursuing its own inherent logic of purification, working within but against the system of production, working within but against the object riddled with error, bring about the ruination of bourgeois culture and society, and do so without overt politics, but rather through a collective physiological labor that had the character of a constantly renewed originary upsurge. The next section is called Optical Instruments. By considering tectonics within the problematics of representation, Benjamin was able to both clarify and radicalize the terms of the tectonic discourse, while functionalist architects and historians of his generation merely eschewed representation, confident of their capacity to step beyond it and materialize the elemental primitiveness of utopia in the here and now of white prismatic volumes, curtain walls, and cantilevered slabs. For Benjamin, the process of physiognomic immanence freeing itself from distorting mediations was not only incomplete, but could not, in fact, be fulfilled by humanity alone. In seeking to conjoin radical messianic Judaism and revolutionary historical materialism, he considered such redemption contingent on superhuman intervention. The hope and even excitement that Benjamin revealed in describing the arcades, exhibitions, and panoramas of the 19th century as, quote, residues of a dream world at the beginning of the bourgeois epoch came from a conviction that in them it was possible to glimpse the face of prehistory, which remained opaque in the artifacts of his own time, that is, at the beginning of the next epoch ushered in by the proletariat. For us, he noted, the enticing and threatening face of prehistory becomes clear in the beginnings of technology. In that which lies closer to our time, it has not yet revealed itself. Benjamin's historicized theory of technological productivity in the field of architecture underscores the significance of metaphors of passage for his theory of history. At the same time, it sets up another constellation of metaphors concerning a new optics, the expansion of vision made possible by modern technologies, including iron structures, that provided unprecedented views of the city, glimpses perhaps of the enticing and threatening face of prehistory, yet to come. As is well known, Benjamin's artwork essay introduced the idea that an equivalent analytical practice had emerged in the realm of the visual to psychoanalysis in the realm of the psyche. Sigmund Freud's psychopathology of everyday life, Benjamin observed, had, quote, isolated and made analyzable things which had heretofore floated along unnoticed in the broad stream of perception. For the entire spectrum of optical perception, the film has brought about a similar deepening of apperception. The technique that Benjamin singled out to exemplify how, quote, the camera introduces us to unconscious optics as psychoanalysis does to unconscious impulses was the close-up, the blow-up, the enlargement, the cropped image, the fragment. With the close-up, he observed space expands. Moreover, quote, the enlargement of a snapshot does not simply render more precise what was in any case already visible, though unclear. It reveals entirely new structural formations of the subject matter. It thereby becomes tangible that a different nature speaks to the camera than to the eye, for in place of a space interwoven with human consciousness, one interwoven with unconsciousness steps in. Such a space interwoven with unconsciousness was palpable for Benjamin, who consistently located the unconscious in the material world itself, not outside, behind, above, or below it, but within, as he did the truth content of the work of art and traces of prehistory. In his first essay on surrealism called Dream Kitsch of 1925, he had distinguished the analytics of the surrealists from those of Freud precisely for tracking down the traces not so much of the soul as of things. For Benjamin, truth was hidden from casual observation, but resided in traces within the welter of base material. He considered it the task of criticism, like the task of history, to make fragments of truth visible and dominant. Regardless of medium, he considered criticism an activity of stripping its objects bare, mortifying them, dragging the truth content of what was depicted in the image out before it, not as, quote, an unveiling that destroys the mystery, but a revelation that does it justice. Thus, the negativity and destructiveness of criticism opens up a moment of revelation, which in turn opens the future potentiality of the object. This notion of potentiality was related to Benjamin's proposition in the mid-20s that phenomena have a natural history, that their nature lies in the full and concentrated scope of that history, in their pre- and fore-history as well as their present state. The idea that this natural history could be fulfilled may be understood within Benjamin's thought as approaching his hope for redemption from yet another perspective. In the artwork essay, Benjamin was concerned with the problem of the work of art in the modern industrial epoch, distinguished not only by mechanical reproducibility, but by phantasmagoria and commodity fetishism. In this context, Benjamin's concern for the intermingling of old and new focused on the perpetuation into the era of capitalism of the old phenomenon of aura, which he defined as a uniqueness that in earlier times dominated by ritual, had enveloped the work of art as, quote, the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close the object may be. During the 19th century, the phenomenon of aura had become an agent of bourgeois mythology, working to maintain dominance over the masses. Without such constraint, he suggested, the class consciousness of the masses would tend to destroy aura as a function of a desire to bring things closer spatially and humanly. The photographic image enabled them to get hold of an object at close range, prying it in its objectivity from its erratic encasement. Elsewhere, he wrote of other tactics for achieving similar ends, proceeding eccentrically and by leaps to rip things out of context in order to highlight the seemingly inconsequential details of larger constructions ignored by the dominant class, and inventing a historiographic telescope capable of seeing through the phantasmagoric fog, a haptic optic instrument for bringing the tangible, tactile concreteness of things closer to view. Just as psychoanalysis treats dream images as rebuses or picture puzzles whose manifest content must be deciphered, so Benjamin discovered in the photographic close-up a technique for reading latent content within the manifest, for seeing hidden significance within the surface. But what is it that he hoped to see? Perhaps justice with respect to the past, repressions and oppressions worked through, the object or event released to fulfill its mysterious potentiality. And how might this have appeared In his surrealism essay of 1929, he suggested that, quote, we penetrate mystery only to the degree that we recognize it in the everyday realm, by virtue of a dialectical optic that perceives the everyday as impenetrable, the impenetrable as everyday. Perhaps such were the affects of the close-up that he had in mind when, in a well-known passage of the artwork essay, he wrote, the moment of the close-up bursts open the prison world of the everyday metropolis, the milieu of the proletariat, the taverns and metropolitan streets, offices and furnished rooms, railroad stations and factories, that appeared to have us locked up hopelessly, so that now, in the midst of its far-flung ruins and debris, we calmly and adventurously go traveling. Benjamin left several concrete clues to the kind of impenetrable images that he associated with such adventurous traveling. I should say, for those not familiar with Benjamin interpretations, that I'm being much more concrete than most interpreters have with respect to trying to tease out what kind of images he really had in mind or was in fact working with. Twice in the notes of the Passagenwerk, he recorded his interest in Gideon's photographs of the Pont Transbordeur in Marseille, in building in France. His letter to Gideon a few weeks following the publication of his surrealism essay reveals the strong affinity that Benjamin felt for Gideon's historiography, his admiration for what he called Gideon's radical knowledge. In the Passagenwerk, he wrote that, quote, just as Gideon teaches us we can read the basic features of today's architecture out of buildings of the 1850s, so would we read today's life, today's forms, out of the life and the apparently secondary, forgotten forms of that era. Familiar with the discourse of the new optics, led in the late 1920s, on the one hand by Gideon's friend László Moholy-Nagy, and on the other by figures like Benjamin's friend Sacha Stone, Benjamin took this ability to read the future in the past as contingent on a new technologically mediated vision. Implicitly, he affiliated this with the tactics developed by the surrealists to produce profane illuminations, glimpses of a surreality within the banal experiences of everyday life, within, for instance, the extraordinary iron and glass structures of 19th century Paris. One of Benjamin's notes begins by citing Gideon's encounter with, quote, the fundamental aesthetic experience of today's building in the wind-swept stairwells of the Eiffel Tower, and even more in the steel supports of the Pont Transbordeur, and here I'm quoting still, where things flow through the thin net of iron spanning the air, ships, sea, houses, masts, landscape, harbor, lose their definition, swirl into one another as we climb downward, simultaneously commingling. And he went on to note that, quote, the glorious views of the cities which the new iron structures afforded, see Gideon illustration 61-63, were initially the exclusive privilege of the workers and engineers. It's these images. Elsewhere, he continued, quote, for who else but the engineers and proletariat climbed these steps which alone at that time provided an opportunity to recognize the decisive new spatial feeling of these iron constructions. These are not Gideon's images or Benjamin's, but they do have the figures involved. While similar structures had been built in Rouen, Nantes, and Bordeaux, it was the swaying, hovering, and dizzying Pont Transbordeur built by the engineer Ferdinand Arnaudin in 1905 across the industrial harbor of Marseille that assumed special significance among the avant-garde. Gideon observed how this, quote, balcony springing into space, photographed by Moholy-Nagy, Germain Krull, Herbert Bayer, Man Ray, and others, had entered the unconscious of modern architecture in Germany. In his words, quote, the new architecture, das Neue Bauen, has unconsciously used these projecting balconies again and again. Why? Because there exists the need to live in buildings that strive to overcome the old sense of equilibrium that was based only on fortress-like incarceration. Gideon had even featured the astonishingly delicate yet bold transporter built to carry a small ferry across the harbor without interfering with the boats on the cover of his book, Building in France. His photographs, as well as his words, treated spatial and optical effects, like those of the Eiffel Tower, as paradigmatic of the emerging epoch. Of course, Meyer had already taken exciting images of technology, such as the bridge over the Firth of Forth that I showed before, as demonstrating, quote, that the power of iron speaks to us and in us in every great train station and exhibition hall, in front of every great iron bridge, and in the fast-paced modern metropolis. That was in 1907. Gideon, too, mobilized a rhetoric that echoed the aesthetics of the sublime, but not as aesthetics. Invoking dematerialization, spatial extension, shadowless light, and air as a constitutive material, he reveled in the fluid and gravity-free interweaving of subject and object, and in the unsettling movement, formlessness, and metamorphosis engendered by the pulse of life in iron structures. Both Meyer and Gideon eschewed bourgeois aesthetic categories and instead treated these new spatial experiences as the structural conditions of the emerging era. For them, technology's transformation of buildings into fleshless open bodies of skeletal transparency, like its transformation of the nature of vision with microscopes, telescopes, aerial photography, and X-rays, marked the emergence of a new mode of perception, cognition, and experience specific to the emerging era. I'm just showing a series of images from that range of photographers I listed a minute ago of the Pont Transbordeur. Hovering weightlessly and breathlessly above the harbor of Marseille, Gideon's iron balcony served to reframe and shatter the familiar, harsh world of the industrial metropolis, providing Benjamin with a graphic image of the threshold of awakening from the dream consciousness of the bourgeoisie. It is telling that Benjamin focused on two particular photographs by Gideon, quite distinct from his dizzying and destabilizing images of the Eiffel Tower, which Gideon had described as exemplary of the kind of new structures, of the tendency of these new structures to, quote, open themselves to all kinds of possibilities and to blur the boundaries of their autonomy in favor of relationships and interpenetrations in which the subject is united with the object in the creative process of space forming. Instead, by selecting abstracted, fragmented, close-up views of the harbor's edge taken from the top of the structure and through its open framework, Benjamin effectively distinguished between two moments in Gideon's thinking. The one that Benjamin identified as radical knowledge, serving historical self-consciousness and justice, the other enthusiastically proclaiming that a new immediacy had already arrived under the sign of a vitalist, technologically mediated transparency in which there is only one great indivisible space, etc., etc., from Gideon. Benjamin focused not on images of the great iron structures themselves, but on the unprecedented views of the city that they afforded. Among Gideon's photographs, only the ones singled out by Benjamin treated the view as mediated, and only in them was the unacknowledged misery of working-class life both revealed and simultaneously transformed into the site of revelation, just as they had been in constructivist films such as Ziggy Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera and Maholi's own film on Marseille, the Old Port of 1929. While Benjamin admired the rationalized technical forms of these montage structures, he referred to the Eiffel Tower as the first instance of montage. He focused on their role as viewing instruments. Like web-like structures, their web-like structures provided opportunities to crop, cut, reframe, and abstract the familiar. Like the lens of a camera, they could reveal hidden secrets and provide glimpses of the estranged within the city of representation, the tiny spark of contingency of the here and now with which this reality has, so to speak, seared its subjects. Benjamin called these views glorious, for they released something of a magnificent potentiality locked within the reality of alienation and exploitation. With Gideon's camera and the power of the close-up to expand space and reveal secrets, Benjamin collapsed Bötticher's tectonic dualism, transforming the hermeneutics of origins into an immanence within representation whose visibility in the present was, however, contingent on technology's most powerful instruments of optical analysis and destruction. To open the object riddled with error, Benjamin mobilized a dialectical optics that, quote, extends our comprehension of the inevitabilities which rule our being, and at the same time manages to secure for us an immense and unexpected space of play. The last section is called Magical Similarities. The affects attributed by Benjamin to the Pont Transporteur bear a striking resemblance to his treatment of photographs by David Octavius Hill, Karl Dautendey, and Karl Blossfeld in his essay called A Small History of Photography of 1931. The fact that a portion of this passage is repeated verbatim in the section of the artwork essay that deals with the power of close-ups to explode the experience of the metropolis invites a reading of Gideon's photographs in terms parallel to Benjamin's reading of these other images. In this way, a third reformulation of the tectonic problematic may be inferred from Benjamin's writings. In his essay on photography, Benjamin suggested that in contrast to painting, with photography, quote, we encounter something new and strange. His interest was captured to begin with by one of the numerous calotypes that Hill had made of fishwives, fishermen, and children in New Haven, Scotland, between 1843 and 1847. Unlike the precision and fidelity of the more expensive daguerreotypes, the soft orange-brown and sepia calotypes, with their diffuseness and transparency, were considered by some the most engaging and truly artistic medium, and came to be admired for their power to evoke personality, to find the presence below the surface, to probe behind appearances. Referring to Hill's portrait of Mrs. Elizabeth Hall on the left, Benjamin observed as follows: in Hill's New Haven fishwife, her eyes cast down in such indolent, seductive modesty, there remains something that goes beyond testimony to the photographer's art, something that cannot be silenced, that fills you with an unruly desire to know what her name was, the woman who was alive there, who even now is still real and will never consent to be wholly absorbed into art. And I ask, how did the beauty of that hair, those eyes beguile our forefathers? How did that mouth kiss? To what desire curls up senseless as smoke without fire? To underscore his concern for the immediacy of lived experience, as captured by the photographer in a tense relationship with his own artful idealizations, Benjamin then turned briefly to a picture by Karl Dautendey, which I have not been able to find. A German post-mortem photographer of the late 19th century living in Moscow at the time that the photograph was taken. Benjamin's description invokes an image of Dautendey himself, together with the woman he was engaged to, lying in the bedroom of his house shortly after the birth of her 6th child. Her arteries were severed and her gaze absorbed in, quote, an ominous distance. The silent violence of this image is both shocking in relation to Hill's image, which I've just shown, and revealing of the unconscious realm that Benjamin saw opened up by the new optics. With these photographs already in mind, Benjamin then continued, and it's a rather lengthy passage, but again, I think it's important. He writes, "Immerse yourself in such a picture long enough, and you will recognize how alive the contradictions are here too. The most precise technology can give its products a magical value, such as a painted picture can never again have for us. No matter how artful the photographer, no matter how carefully posed his subject, the beholder feels an irresistible urge to search such a picture for the tiny spark of contingency, of the here and now with which reality has, so to speak, seared the subject. To find the inconspicuous spot where in the immediacy of that long-forgotten moment, the future subsists so eloquently that we, looking back, may rediscover it. For it is another nature that speaks to the camera than to the eye, other in the sense that a space interwoven with human consciousness gives way to a space interwoven with the unconscious. It is through photography that we first discover the existence of this optical unconscious, just as we discovered the instinctual unconscious through psychoanalysis." That was the section that overlaps with the artwork essay. Details of structure, cellular tissue, with which technology and medicine are normally concerned, all this is in its origins more native to the camera than the atmospheric landscape of the soulful portrait. Yet at the same time, photography reveals in this material the physiognomic aspects of visual worlds which dwell in the smallest things, meaningful yet covert enough to find a hiding place in waking dreams, but which, enlarged and capable of formulation, make the difference between technology and magic visible as a thoroughly historical value. Adding a third image to this constellation, Benjamin then turned to the astonishing plant photographs of Professor Karl Blossfeld, architect and teacher at the United States School of Fine and Applied Art in Berlin. The images appeared in Blossfeld's book of 1928 called Art Forms of Nature, together with an interpretation by Karl Nierendorf, whose thoughts share certain affinities with Benjamin's own. Paraphrasing Nierendorf, Benjamin wrote that Blossfeld's uncanny photographs reveal the forms of ancient columns in horse willow, a bishop's crozier in the ostrich fern, totem poles in tenfold enlargements of chestnut and maple shoots, and Gothic tracery in the fuller's thistle. Hill's subjects, too, were probably not far from the truth when they described the phenomenon of photography as still being a great and mysterious experience. I'm still quoting Benjamin here. Even if for them this is no more than the consciousness of standing before a device which in the briefest time could produce a picture of the visible environment that seemed as real and alive as nature itself. Now, at the risk of reduction, condensing Benjamin's eloquently woven thoughts may help to register more emphatically some of the links between these various ideas. That the most precise technology can give its products a magical value. That the photographic enlargement can reveal a secret within the physiognomic surface of things. That secret is visible in a tiny spark of contingency with which reality has seared the subject, in inconspicuous spots where in the immediacy of that long-forgotten moment the future subsists so eloquently that we, looking back, may recognize it. And recognize it as another nature, one interwoven with unconsciousness, all of which makes possible a great and mysterious experience, an experience of the natural within the human and the human within the natural, an experience whereby the difference between technology and magic is seen to be strictly historical, implying not only their commonality but also a future potentiality. That magic, the correspondence between the natural and the human, has a history, and that this was subsumed into the history of technology, was most explicitly treated by Benjamin through the concept of similarity in his essays The Similar and On the Mimetic Faculty, both of 1933, same year as his essay Experience in Poverty, in which glass architecture plays such a key role. There he described how humanity's special gift for seeing and producing similarities between the human and non-human has a history that is both phylogenetic and ontogenetic, that is, a history within the species that parallels its history within the life of each of its members. In other words, this faculty changes over the course of historical development as it does over the life of each person. Just as, quote, children's play is everywhere permeated by mimetic modes of behavior, the child plays at being not only a shopkeeper or teacher, but also a windmill and a train. So in other essays, Benjamin characterized the proletariat as the newborn children of the emerging industrial era, whose games always try to begin again at the beginning. While it appears that the mimetic faculty has decayed over time, that, quote, the observable world of modern man contains only minimal residues of the magical correspondences and analogies that were familiar to ancient peoples, Benjamin suggested that this faculty has rather been transformed into a non-sensuous similarity, now born exclusively by language. He writes, the coherence of words and sentences, the semiotic aspect of language, is the bearer through which, like a flash, similarity appears. But Benjamin's apparent exclusion of the sensuous here needs to be qualified by the dependence of language on the sensuous media of speech and script, just as flames rely on substances that burn. Notwithstanding his emphasis on modern semiotic language, Benjamin also treated modern technologies of mechanical production and reproduction, photography and film, glass and iron, as bearers of correspondences between the human and the non-human. Benjamin's concept of similarity concerned the affects of these things as much as their attributes. As technical forms that had been reduced to the limit of their objectification, these media, like the sober technical language that Benjamin admired in Brecht and in Scheerbardt, held the special potential of not only materializing similarity in their elemental form, but bringing the similarity hidden in other things into momentary visibility. They were instruments capable of producing glimpses, which the snap of the shutter, the dynamite of the tenth of a second, was able to rip from the flesh of history and preserve. Believing that every epoch dreams its successor, Benjamin was especially attentive to utopian schemes. One of his earliest versions of the Arcades project was even titled after an image by the French humorist J.J. Grandville from his 1843 satire of modernist utopias called Another World. In his précis of 1928-29 for the Arcades project, which he titled The Ring of Saturn, or Something About Iron Construction, which is Benjamin's first précis of the big project, he suggested that a small cosmic vignette by Grandville might demonstrate, in the form of a grotesque, the infinite opportunities that the 19th century saw opened up with iron construction. Focusing on the adventures of a small goblin named Hubble, trying to find his way around in space, Grandville's story was accompanied by an etching that depicts an iron bridge with gas lanterns springing from planet to planet in an indefinite perspective, and an unending passage into the infinite depths of space. The 333,000th pillar, we are told, rests on Saturn, where the goblin sees that the ring of this planet is nothing but an iron balcony on which the inhabitants of the planet take the evening air. Preceding Böttiger's text on iron by 2 years, the Crystal Palace by 9, and the Eiffel Tower by over 40, the bridge and balcony are remarkably modern and transparent as technical forms, free of historical stylization. There's a funny little temple at the end, though, which one would need to worry about. Later in the exposé of 1935, Benjamin still included this image in the section on Grandville or the World Exhibitions, calling it a graphic utopia. To be able to commune with the cosmos, to link the past and future, to produce similarities between representation and alterity without restriction, such could be the opportunities of technology and industrialization pursued rationally to their ultimate potential beyond the exploitation of nature under capitalism. But let us remember that this image of absolute unity and openness was a satire of utopians like Fourier and the Saint-Simonians, that Benjamin admired the caricatures of Karl Kraus for creeping into those he impersonates in order to annihilate them, and that he concluded his tribute to the utopian fantasist Paul Scherbart, written in the final months of his life, by recalling that, quote, "Art is not the forum of utopia. Of that greater something, the fulfillment of utopia, one cannot speak, only bear witness." Thank you.
So Detlef has agreed to take some questions. I think it would be great if there were some. Brian, you're normally good at these questions on Benjamin. So do you have one prepared? There's one back there. Michael, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. You used the word uncanny in relation to the Rosfeld photography. You used the word uncanny in relation. You used the word uncanny in relation to the Blossfeld. Is that unheimlich? Is that coming from Benjamin's description of Blossfeld?
It is, yes. I mean, if you like, I can double check this, but I believe so.
The question really is, Benjamin seems to be observing uncanny and other phenomena in Blossfeld, which is a set of growing things. And also in constructed, most of the examples were industrial.
Yes.
So things resisting forces, perhaps in a similar way, at least in structural terms, that both are resisting forces, the growing thing and the industrial thing. But for Benjamin, Benjamin, does the uncanny also lie in the raw material before it has either grown or been assembled by the constructor or the engineer? Does the actual raw material, for example, I suppose soil, water, metal,
Yeah.
how can we start to penetrate where this
Yeah.
unheimlich
Yeah.
or this uncanny starts to appear? Because isn't it either in the transformation of the material through processes or residing in the material itself before anything's done to it?
I mean, I don't. I mean, Benjamin would resist any effort. I mean, this was part of the reason for ending the way I tried to end. He would resist any effort to try to actually make claims for something that is archaic or primal or actually utopian. So in that respect, that's where I think this notion of the glimpse is so important for him. It's through these kind of dialectical tactics that he pursues that things like glimpses, interruptions, etc., are possible, and or make possible everything from a sense of a kind of visual cognition that glimpse gives you, that this word gives you, to in other passages suggesting that by means of such interruptions it would be possible for divine intervention to enter in. It's not, Benjamin is not really much of a reader of Freud. He is a bit, he reads the interpretation of dreams, and it's not the topic of the uncanny per se is not developed, and indeed I think I would really need to double check my notes to make sure that that's in the quote and not just something that I've added to the beginning of the quote. I think it may actually be an addition of mine. I think this longing that exists for something that is a kind of ur form, raw material, etc., is something that he's very suspicious of. I think he would, in the end, want to defer that in time, want to defer that to some kind of a radical change in the world.
I mean, I think that or we could think of examples where the phenomenology of materials has been observed in their condition per se, in their condition as materials.
Yes.
Perhaps a great deal is being exposed now through science about some things that we could actually observe or be aware of through various methods.
And I think the thing that's interesting
I'm sorry, you're just suggesting that he would resist the phenomenology of the material itself.
Yeah, I mean, let's say, everything is always sort of, there are two moments in Benjamin for almost all questions. So on the one hand, he does this research on the history of iron and glass. He's interested in these texts that treat the material of iron and glass as they're synthetic materials, and that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. And treats them, the text that he reads treats them as precisely origins in the terms that I think you're wishing them to be. And to some extent, Benjamin accepts these as histories. He aligns them, in a certain sense, with his reading of historical materialist histories of the 19th century. And so there is this kind of interest in a productivity that emerges out of these new materials, unformed things that are somehow emerging, right? Or they have mysterious origins, etc. He's interested in that, I think, primarily strategically, right? That these have the capacity to disrupt representation. Not that they are in themselves what their authors might absolutely claim. I mean, it's a hard one because he does. There are moments where he clearly is making. He's not quite making claims for elementalism, you know, as the architects might of the same period, but he understands that, he knows that, and he's kind of moving with it. Now, I should also say that this material is from before 1933, and that he will become, like so many, less optimistic about the immediate future and the potentials of technology and all these other things to actually bring about a radical change in the world. But it's because of the potentiality, I'd say, more than the substance of matter. It's more its potentiality and its strategic value for kind of wearing down the bourgeois culture, bourgeois representation, that he's interested in these things.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Do you think that in the same way that Jung sees the unconscious symbolism of man, the unconscious, in the same way that Jung seems to see unconscious elements of man in his symbolism, do you think that perhaps Benjamin sees unconscious elements of society in these buildings, these structures like the bridges?
Right. I would say he's definitely, there's something about the unconscious that he's seeing in these things, but it's not Jungian, and he's quite explicit about that. Again, it's not geared towards archetypes or some kind of urform, some sort of an absolute in those terms. He's interested in the ways in which iron and glass and concrete construction emerges out of apparently nowhere. I mean, this is a peculiarity, of course, in the writing of history, that somehow the engineers are nobody, and they're faceless, and so hence it's mysterious that suddenly we have these new materials, right? The inventors, the constructors, the engineers are just not named. So I mean, there are many problems, I think, with the histories that he receives, in fact, and takes up. It's not I think from today's perspective, there are some big problems there. But he treats them as things which have a kind of mysterious origin, and therefore are privileged in some way. That there's something going on here which suggests the possibility of what he calls, glimpsing the enticing and threatening face of prehistory in iron constructions. What I was trying to do in the lecture is to say that there are these two different moments of that. There's a theory of production at work, which is the one we've just been talking about, but there's also the optics, so that these structures are not just forms in themselves, and it's not as forms that I think they're certainly that's not the only interest he has in them. He has interest in them in the same way that he does with the lens of a camera, that they allow you to see things that had been not visible before. They reframe the city. They explode the everyday metropolis. And I mean, I wish one could have shown also something like Maholi's film on Marseille, just to also get a sense of. I mean, I know earlier this week, I think Vertov's film was playing somewhere here in London, and one really needs to have those films or Eisenstein's Potemkin in mind, because they're points of reference for him. These are stills in a way, where the films are, I think, probably more potent.
From Benjamin's trip to Marseille, the episode that always intrigued me is not his trip to the bridge, but his trip to the cathedral, which he describes as a sort of nocturnal railway station. Sleeping cars depart from here to eternity at mass times. It's a railway station which mysteriously can never be open to traffic. It's a sort of hallucination upon a 19th century Beaux-Arts monster, which is directly comparable, I suppose, or certainly reminiscent to me of paintings by, say, Paul Delvaux, surrealistic, metaphoric transformation. Now, it seems to me that in taking the bridge as a balcony, a kind of Vertoffian balcony on new angles on the city, then he's suggesting that the new structures can offer a kind of metonymic disruption of traditional perception. But at the same time, he seems to be enjoying, if not actually consciously celebrating, the metaphoric possibilities in the ideological carapaces, which is actually rejecting simultaneously. And you find a similar situation perhaps with Salvador Dali, who actually revels in the execrable sort of carapaces of bourgeois ideology. And in some sense, surrealism would be lost without them. So there's a kind of instability in the representations where there's a sort of almost willing enjoyment in that which is being rejected at another remove. And in fact, the full dialectical account would have to incorporate the instability of one thing turning into another. In Rimbaud's Les Illuminations, he says, I saw very clearly a mosque in place of a factory. But in fact, later on, it's in a sense the factory turning into a mosque, or at least a temple of some kind, which, when you go to Russia, is ironically realized when you find that a lot of the Soviet churches were in fact turned into factories. So I just wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
I mean, it's. I think you're right on. I mean, it's. You know, this work I've been doing has deliberately emphasized his interest in engineering, and in some respects, I've de-emphasized his surrealist leanings, and that's partly because of his critiques of surrealism in his essay of 1929, where he actually invokes engineering as an antidote to what he calls the tendency to dwell on the mysterious side of the mysterious, and there are a whole series of other characterizations. So, Benjamin interpretation is a highly volatile thing. I mean, it's like the writing is so suggestive in many ways and elusive in many ways that it can be kind of, moved one way or another. And I guess I've been, I wouldn't, there's the thing that I think actually he refers to in the note on the Pont Transbordeur, where he says that this is the new spatial feeling. The proletariat and engineers are the first to experience this new spatial feeling. If we read that with Gideon, and the prose in Gideon's Building in France is ecstatic prose. And in fact, Gideon, even in that book, talks about intoxication, and he talks about preferring, I can't remember it exactly, but he talks about preferring something that's made possible by engineering to the rush of cocaine. And so if we think of Benjamin reading these texts and becoming interested in fact mobilizing engineering and engineered architecture, rationality, the most severe, extremely rational architecture of his moment, then in doing so precisely as a kind of corrective to surrealism, and invoking at the same time the image of glass architecture from Scheerbart, Le Corbusier, and Ode's buildings to do this in terms of his own contemporaries, then it seems to me there's maybe the possibility of thinking these kind of dialectical relationships that he is interested in sustaining, but within the framework of engineering constructions, this kind of intoxicated, ecstatic spatial experience that Gideon thematizes. I mean, probably many other ways of approaching an interpretation of these passages. I mean, the thing that I'm also really struck by is that in the I think there's a couple of things. He's certainly not the only person. There are many people in this period who are trying to think rationality and fantasy together as conditions. It's a sort of topos. It becomes a topos of the 20s in Germany. So to try to think fashion through rationality, or do you think rationality through fantasy? Don't know. But something's going on in that relationship, and that it does have to do with fantasy opening up of new worlds. I guess that's the implication in his Pont Transvaudeux notes, in the notes on the Pont Transvaudeux through Gideon.
Well, I'm sure that those people who would like to continue the conversation, they'll turn up on Thursday when you'll have the seminar. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Detlef.
Thank you.